Welcome back. Thank you for joining us again today as we continue our seminar on God's plan for end-time wellness centers. And He has a purpose for these in these last days, and it's very important that we follow the instruction of the Lord. In fact, I'd like to point out a statement that you find in Counsels on Health, page 533. It says, "I wish to tell you that soon there will be no work done in ministerial lines, but medical missionary work." So not only is medical missionary work part of ministerial lines, it is also the last work that will be done. No other ministerial work will be able to be done eventually. So let's begin with prayer as we ask God to bless us today as we study and try to understand His counsel concerning wellness centers in the last days. Our Father in heaven, thank you for Jesus Christ, who has given us a very special work in these last days to convince and convict the people of the world of the soon coming of Jesus and the need to bring their lives into harmony with His principles, the three angels' messages. So we ask that your Holy Spirit would be present today as we study. In Jesus' name, amen. Here's another statement I'd like to share with you. It's from Testimonies for the Church, Volume 7, page 62. Testimonies for the Church, Volume 7, page 62. We have come to a time when every member of the church should take hold of medical missionary work. This is an underlying concept, an underlying statement that every church member should be in some way a medical missionary. That doesn't mean they have to know everything about anatomy and physiology and the various causes and effects of disease, but they should need to have a general understanding of those things. And so we need to teach the concepts of health and medical missionary work in the church itself so that we can motivate members to become more interested in health. They can bring their lives into harmony with the health principles, and then they can start sharing it with others. That's the ideal. It rarely happens, and unfortunately, sometimes there's even opposition, because in some places of the world today, people are, in fact, church leaders sometimes oppose the health message. So it's very important that we understand that every church member is to be involved in medical missionary work. And with a very broad definition of medical missionary work, there is many ways to engage in it. If you're benefiting somebody else in some way, it is a form of medical missionary work. So God gives us a broad base so that everybody can be involved, not just those who are professionally trained and have degrees in medicine or nursing or in some other way. Now, there was a statement I read a couple of days ago, I guess, or a couple of sessions ago at least, which I want to draw your attention to once again. And I want you to notice something about this statement. It says, our people should be looking for opportunities to purchase properties away from the cities on which buildings already erected and orchards are already bearing. I think that's a very interesting statement. If you're looking for a place to begin your work, God gives you this counsel. And it's important counsel because there's a very specific reason why. It's not stated in this statement as to why this is an important principle, but I have observed over the years the reason for this statement. You see, when you go to start a new work and you need support from people, donors, friends, whoever it may be, you need to be able to start your work fairly quickly. The more you drag out the process, the more discouraged people will become with how this process is going. In other words, if you are planning to start, you need to start as soon as possible. And properties with buildings already erected, even if they're not entirely adequate, is better than just having raw land and starting from the beginning. You know, some people might say, well, isn't it better to just build it the way you want it? And yes, there are some advantages to that, but the problem is that unless you are able to do that very quickly, you may lose the interest of some of your key supporters. And that's why it's very important to have buildings already erected. When we organized to purchase Heartland, the property at Heartland, years and years ago, we looked for a place that had buildings already erected. And we found that particular place. It had a large mansion. It had a number of homes where staff could live. The large mansion actually was dual use. We had both the school in the same building as the wellness center. And that had its challenges. And of course, as you know from another statement that we read earlier, that or that you'll actually read very soon, is that the schools are to be associated with wellness centers, but they are to not be sort of on top of each other. And but that's what we had to do to get started until we could build a new building for the lifestyle center. And God bless that. And it worked okay. And we got through that early period when it was the most difficult time in starting up the work. So she goes on to say that land is a valuable possession, and connected with our sanitariums there should be lands, small portions of which can be used for the homes of the helpers. So in other words, you don't want to just buy, a 2 or 3 acre plot where you can build your little health center or wellness center and then not have any room to expand and grow. Because if you read the counsel of the Lord, it's not just the wellness center. There needs to be other activities going on, whether publishing houses, whether they're schools or retail establishments. There's a lot of possibilities, and you need a little bit of elbow room by which to make this work. So you need property that's large enough. Heartland had ultimately 575 acres. Our work in Australia has 102 acres. I think 100 acres is probably well enough. You can even get by with less if not all your staff are living on your campus. But you need to have some space, some separation, so that the wellness center can be away from where the staff live and where the school is. In our work in Australia and Victoria, we have a school, a small school, and it is a little bit of ways away from the health retreat, the wellness center, and that means that there's some distance between them, and the school can do its thing and the health center can do its thing. And yet they can collaborate together. So there's a very interesting statement. In fact, there's a series of statements that I'd like to share with you regarding schools and sanitariums or wellness centers connected together. An educational work, this is from Counsels on Health 242, an educational work should be carried on in connection with all our sanitariums. Now, she's not saying that every sanitarium has to have an established school on its campus, but there should be educational work going on. In other words, the health retreats or the wellness centers should provide opportunities for training of young people, or for that matter, adults, so that they can understand how to do medical missionary work and how to start and run little home-style wellness centers. So an educational work should be carried on in connection with all our sanitariums. There is a close relation between the work of our schools and sanitariums. All right, so the school and the sanitarium need to work together. And wherever it is practical, there are decided advantages in having a school in close connection with a sanitarium, wherever it's possible. So it means it's not maybe possible in every place, but wherever you can. And there would be, in such an arrangement, decided advantages to both lines of work. Both the sanitarium or the wellness center and the school will gain benefit by working closer together. And then she goes on to say in Letter 25, 1902, small sanitariums should be established in connection with our larger schools, that students may have opportunity to gain a knowledge of medical missionary work. We need to train as many medical missionaries as we possibly can. And this line of work is to be brought into our schools as a part of the regular instruction. All right, so in other words, medical missionary work is destined or is designed to be part of the curriculum of the schools that we have available. This would be, of course, the schools that comply with God's principles. Those that don't are already in compromise, and they're going to have a difficulty training in the kind of things that God wants us to be trained in these last days. What does it mean to be a regular part of the curriculum? Well, that means that there are courses that are included in the curriculum that are specifically designed to train the students in medical missionary work. Perhaps the foundation would be something like anatomy and physiology, followed by disease process classes, and then followed by natural remedy classes, so that it can understand not only the causes of disease and the processes of disease, but also how to heal the diseased person. Now, did you notice the statement said there are decided advantages? What are those decided advantages for the schools? Well, students can do some of the work as part of their training in the Wellness Center. Under supervised guidance, it builds their confidence so that when they interact with the guests, they are able then to connect at a level that is credible not only to the client or to the guest, but also to the school. And the Wellness Center can be a training center, practical training. They get their practicums there. They get their internships there. And that gives them the kind of training they need. Then they can go out and start their own home style or even larger health retreats or wellness centers. It also, by the way, helps to reduce cost to the wellness center. Because if the student is trained, or I should say once the student is trained, then they can be effective in therapy or in some other area of the wellness center, and that would reduce the need for staff members that we would have to pay for as wellness centers. So it can actually save some cost. And at the same time, the student can perhaps reduce some of his fees, his tuition, his room and board, whatever those fees might be. There's another advantage that comes to the wellness centers as a result of the schools being right nearby. Young people are naturally or generally inspiring. If they are godly young people, they're going to be inspiring to the guests and the clients. And I don't remember, I don't know how many times people have said to me how inspiring and enthusiastic the students are. And these are guests that come with depression and anxiety, and they're uncertain and they're worried, all these things, and the students just give them happiness and peace, and they see the joy on their faces, and they really respond to that. So there's a side to that that's actually very useful to the wellness center. By the way, I should throw in here that we need to be careful with students coming in and working with the clients, especially in therapy, for instance, because if they're not properly trained, the student is nervous and doesn't know their work assignment, and the guest feels this sense of anxiety, and it can make them nervous. So when a student actually comes in to work in therapy, and we integrate them in our work down in Victoria, we integrate students into our therapy department. And when the student is properly trained, they just easily move right in and take on the guest, and the guest feels comfortable, generally speaking. But one of the challenges that we've had is that if a student hasn't had enough practice and they're not confident, that conveys to the client, to the guest. So what we do is we have them train on each other. They practice on each other until they know that therapy so well that they can do it almost in their sleep, you know. And then we give them the opportunity to work with the guest or the client. And that is a much easier way to bring them in to the health center's therapy department. There are other synergies. Perhaps because of the school and the wellness center together, there can maybe be some purchasing power sometimes, perhaps often the leftovers from the kitchen in the lifestyle center or the wellness retreat can be used as food for the students in the dormitory, as long as it's only warmed once, I think is the way the regulation is, or at least in some places. So you can do it once, and that helps to save costs among the students as well. Another synergy that is involved is that young people can witness too. If they're careful and if they're trained well. Once again, they need to be trained properly to understand how to witness and how not to offend. Perhaps this is even more important. So that they're able to share their faith without creating disruption. We had a young person at one of our retreats. I may have mentioned this the other day, and she was doing therapy, and one day the guest that she was working on asked her this question, and it caught her by surprise. She asked, "Is it easy to become a Seventh-day Adventist?" Well, that's kind of poking right at one of the main reasons why our wellness centers and retreats exist. And so after a while, they sorted that out, and they conducted Bible studies with her over Skype for quite some time. And I don't know where that's going to end up, but the Lord is dropping seeds in her mind, you see. So it's very important to think through how to train students, because the thing about it is, if you don't have a training program, you aren't going to be able to be sustainable down the track. Training programs are very important so that wellness centers become sustainable. You have to continue to bring in new staff, because not only do people's lives change and they have to move on, but also there are new wellness centers being developed here and there on an ongoing basis, and they need staff too. They need trained people to do their work. So it's important to have a training school for that reason as well. And by the way, the training school provides health, knowledge, and experience that the students can use the rest of their lives. So what they learn in the school and then they practice in the wellness center, they can then use in other times in their lives. And that also builds up a reservoir of support and interest and encouragement and perhaps staffing for wellness centers down the track. There are also other decided advantages. The wellness center provides practical training for the students, as we've already noted. But that's something that the school actually needs. For the school to have a wellness center located nearby where students can actually get involved in direct practical training early on in their experience, it gives them a great advantage from an academic point of view. Because once they've done a little work in the wellness center and they see the results and they understand how the clients think about it all and respond to it, then they go back and they get more intensively interested in their studies, because this gives them motivation to dig more deeply, to learn more thoroughly, and prepare for this kind of life of service. In other words, it inspires the students to go deeper and to strengthen their skills. Also, the work of the schools together with the sanitarium or the wellness center teaches the students in a very practical way how to be workers for suffering humanity. Perhaps there's nothing more motivating than working to benefit somebody else. And I've mentioned this in another context in terms of fundraising. But if you are able to teach young people the joy and the thrill of being able to change somebody else's life for the better because of the skills they've learned in the school, you've gained a huge advantage with them. And I should also add that the students experience firsthand the faith that is required to work with guests in a health retreat. You see, wellness centers require faith, a lot of faith, I might add, and students see that in action. So working with the guests requires a lot of faith, and the students can participate in that, and they can learn how to exercise faith and trust in God to solve the problems that they face. They get to see it in action, and it trains them. It trains their minds, it trains their hearts, and it trains them and motivates them to become very effective in medical missionary work. So those are some of the decided advantages that the school and the wellness center provide to each other. Now here's a statement from 9th volume of the Testimonies, page 178. 9th volume of the Testimonies, page 178. It is well that our training schools for Christian workers should be established near to our health institutions. So training schools to be nearby health institutions, that the students may be educated in the principles of healthful living. Institutions that send forth workers who are able to give a reason for their faith, and who have faith which works by love and purifies the soul, are of great value. I have clear instruction that wherever it is possible, schools should be established near to our sanitariums, that each institution may be a help and a strength to the other. He who created man has an interest in those who suffer. He has directed in the establishment of our sanitariums and in the building up of our schools close to our sanitariums, that they may become efficient mediums in training men and women for the work of ministering to suffering humanity. So there you see the value, the spiritual value of medical missionary work. From Medical Ministry 156, the sanitariums established in the future are not to be immense, expensive buildings. Did you hear that? We're not to aim for expensive buildings. They need to be quality buildings, but not expensive buildings. Small, local sanitariums are to be established in connection with our schools. So now the question is, how many schools should there be? Well, you know, if there is a number of sanitariums around a big city, for instance, and this doesn't happen, at least it hasn't happened yet, although I think God would be pleased if a city like New York, for instance, had several sanitariums around it, you know, in various radius around the city, or Philadelphia or Washington, D.C., or just wherever. These cities are big enough that there is probably enough room for several sanitariums or wellness centers around them. But anyway, these wellness centers should be small local health centers or wellness centers. So several sanitariums within range of a single school could be a great blessing. You know, these affiliate wellness centers can be used to polish off the students as interns. So in other words, if there's a school and a wellness center right nearby, that school. There can be other wellness centers, small home-style wellness centers at other parts of the country around the city and not far from the school that students can then go to become interns and to develop and mature their skills in those places as well. But you still need to have a wellness center close to the school, close enough that they can get all their basic training. And then when they go farther afield to the other sanitariums, they can polish off their skills as interns. Perhaps that's the best way to put it. Anyway, we'll talk a bit later about the size of sanitariums or wellness centers, but note that we are to include the school in the blueprint. Now, we talked about the blueprint a little bit, and I hope we were able to talk about it some more. But the sanitariums or the wellness centers are to be small. I don't know if that means 2 or 3 guests or 5 or 6 guests. I suppose it depends a lot on the circumstances, and there's no specific guidance to identify what a small sanitarium actually is. But we have to use our sanctified judgment and the guidance of the Lord in organizing these small places. This is from Counsels on Health, page 542. I am thankful when I think of the advantages enjoyed by the schools that are established near our sanitariums, so that the work of the 2 educational institutions can blend. Did you notice that the sanitarium or the wellness center is to be a educational institution? We have to get this in our minds. It's not just for healing, but it's also for training. And that's important, as I said earlier, for sustainability. The students in these schools, while gaining an education in the knowledge of present truth, can also learn how to be ministers of healing in the wellness center to those whom they go forth to serve, is how the statement actually ends. Schools should be teaching present truth along with medical missionary work. In other words, the school's emphasis should be both Bible or Bible work and medical missionary work. The 2 have to go together. And that's an important concept that we could mature and develop even more than we have already. Here's from Counsels on Health 396. The nurses who are trained in our institutions are to be fitted up to go out as medical missionary evangelists. Nurses as medical missionary evangelists. Uniting the ministry of the Word with that of physical healing. You know, there was a concept that was developed in the city of Chicago back in the day that Ellen White was around and shortly after her time. The sanitarium in Battle Creek, as I recall, organized to have its students that were trained in medical missionary work to become local health reform nurses and educators around the city of Chicago. And so these would then be not only feeding clients back to the sanitarium or the wellness center, as they called them sanitariums back then, but they can also minister to people directly in their homes and influence them with the gospel. That's a very good idea. I'm not exactly sure how to pull all that together. They would have to have a place to live, and they would have to be in a relatively rural setting. But you know, to get into a major city, it takes time, and it's not easy to establish that kind of work. But then again, that's partly why there are to be city centers of influence. A city center of influence can provide some housing for a few workers, temporary housing that is, so that they can have a place in the country where they can live, but they can also overnight in the city when they're actually doing ministry in the city. So those are some concepts that have arisen out of this blueprint idea that we get from the Bible and the spirit of prophecy especially. But the bottom line here in this statement is that health workers should also have training in Bible work. You know, there's hardly any point in just being a health worker. But the whole purpose is to bring them to the Lord and bring them to the truth. So they need to be able to do some Bible work as well. Here's a statement from Manuscript Releases, Volume 14, page 45. Manuscript Releases, Volume 14, page 45. As regards the Graysville Sanitarium, I am glad that you have secured a location on the hillside. Time will demonstrate the value of having your sanitarium at considerable distance from other buildings. So in other words, on the same property, you have these buildings and they're spread out, but they're spread out a considerable distance. In our schoolwork at Avondale, our brethren desired to have the church and the sanitarium close to the school. But again and again, instruction was given me that we must not put our buildings close together. There must be a good reason for that. You don't want to have a little city out there in the country, right on your campus, you know. Spread it out so there's elbow room and that each part of the organization has its own space. We must not put our buildings close together. The Graysville Sanitarium, by the way, was located near Graysville, Tennessee, and it was located by a school called Graysville Academy. And by the way, that's in southeastern Tennessee. And it later became the foundation, or what eventually became in another location, Southern Adventist University. I have written, Ellen White says in letter 48, 1906, I have written and said that the sanitarium should not be left till last, but should be erected at once. In other words, it almost sounds as if the sanitarium or the wellness center is more important to erect than the school, first and foremost, if you're going to build a building. And that's actually what we did at Heartland. We had it all combined in one large building until we could erect a sanitarium or a wellness center nearby. And then they moved out into that facility. I have said that it should not be large, expensive building, and that it should stand at a sufficient distance from the school buildings. I have said that the building should be of moderate size. So in other words, you know, you have to think carefully about what you're doing, because if you build a building that's too big and you have too many guest rooms and you can't fill those guest rooms, you have an expense that's an ongoing weekly and monthly expense that you can't support because you don't have enough guests to support it. And that was one of the problems we had. We built a building at Heartland that was too big. And it was very hard to keep it filled with clients. We had vision. We knew what we wanted to do, but to get it up and running was challenging. And so you need to think about not making your place too big, because every square inch of building has to be insured. It has to be electrified. It has to be depreciated. It has to have all these costs and expenses associated with it. Some are tangible and some are actually intangible. That, the bigger the building is, the more cost you've got. So you need to think about how effective is your marketing going to be, how effective are you going to be in your building up your reputation. It's better to start small and then add on, if necessary, down the track a little ways. So that's a little counsel that I think is especially relevant. And by the way, that last statement was rather interesting. The school is to be a little separated, a little distance from the sanitarium. Ellen White does not say how far they should be, just that they are not to interfere one with the other. Perhaps they are on the same property or very nearby, another property nearby. There's no real clarification here. And perhaps it might even be better to put it another way. In order for the school and the sanitarium or the wellness center to work well together, the leaders of those two organizations need to have good communication and be very flexible. One of the things I've learned about working together with schools and wellness centers is that they both need to be flexible. And fortunately, I'm working in a situation in Victoria where we have a little school. It's a one-year medical missionary training school that is training young people and adults in how to run and establish and operate these little home-style residential lifestyle or wellness centers. The leader of the school is not run by our organization. It's run by another organization with whom we have partnered. So we partnered with the school, and they have put the school on our campus so that they can give the students practical training in our wellness center. This means, though, that the leader of the school and myself, or the leader of the wellness center, whoever that is, need to work together. And I've learned that I have to be very flexible, and the school director has to be very flexible. And we found a good way to do this, because it happens that both of us tend to be willing to collaborate and work together as best we can. There are sometimes stresses and challenges that exist between these two organizations. And if the leaders understand that and they work together, it can be successful. In fact, it must be successful. We must find ways to work together and be flexible, because this is the counsel of the Lord. So there's a couple of points. One should not control the other. In other words, it's a partnership. And both have an important role to play. One is not important than the other. The school is not more important than the wellness center, and the wellness center is not more important than the school. They have to be understood to work together to be most effective as a partnership. So, as I mentioned, ours is not in the same building. The school is actually a good 7-minute walk from the wellness center. At least that's where the dormitory and some of the classes and the dining area for the students is. And it's about, like I said, about a 7-minute hike up the back hill to the back part of the campus, where there are staff homes and the dormitory as well. We also have a school building which we're actually in the process of converting to other uses in addition to the school, and it will be it is about maybe a 4-minute walk from the wellness center. So, you know, it's not right on top of it. It's not in the same building, and it's not right snuggled up close together. There's some elbow room there, and that gives some space for both organizations to feel comfortable working together. The point is that the school and the sanitarium are to cooperate and work together. As I said, the directors of both have to be flexible and friends, that they can do this effectively. 7th volume of the Testimonies, page 59. 7th volume of the Testimonies, page 59. Small local sanitariums are to be established in connection with our training schools. In these sanitariums, young men and young women of ability and consecration are to be gathered. I want you to notice that word consecration. Not every student should come to the training school for medical missionary work. If they're not consecrated, they're going to cause you perhaps more trouble than they're worth, ultimately. Now, every person is worth a lot in terms of salvation, but you can't bring young people into an environment that they're not ready for. Otherwise, there will be issues. And after all, let me ask this question. How easy is it to find consecrated young people today? It is increasingly difficult, I have to say, which gives us an extra challenge. You know, schools generally are probably going to have to be relatively small. And what I've noticed is that medical missionary training schools or Bible worker training schools or schools in general are actually quite small, self-supporting, schools of the prophets tend to be smaller organizations than our major denominational institutions. And this is important because, you know, there's not that many young people that are really that interested in becoming medical missionaries, because it's a sacrifice, it's self-denial, it's not easy to do this. So you have to find young people that are especially consecrated. We don't run the school at Abide Wellness Retreat in Victoria, as I said, but we partner with the other organization. Now, there's two types of arrangement. As I said, we partner in Victoria, but at Heartland, both the school and the sanitarium were run by the same organization. Both have their challenges. Both types of relationships and organizations have their challenges. And I can't say that one is necessarily better than the other. And so we've tried both. I've been involved in both, and my experience is that if you can partner and still achieve the same result, you know, you have just as good of a way of reaching the training goals that you have for the students as you will if they're under the same organizational structure, the same management structure. So both are possibilities. The curriculum needs to be coordinated in the school with the needs of the wellness center. For instance, if you don't teach anatomy and physiology, followed by disease process, followed by hydrotherapy and simple water treatments, in the early part of the program, you can't really use the students in the wellness center until they get that training. So if it's down later in the school year, when they get those basic principles and training, then you don't really have them until they're really near the end of their program, and you can't really train them in the practical side very well. So there's some things you have to think through. Even while the student is studying, the health retreat gains. You know, once the student has been trained a little bit in practical things, they can start using them, and they can gain the benefit of having the students around. Here's a statement from 7th volume of the Testimonies, 102. I have been repeatedly shown that it is not wise to erect mammoth sanitariums. Now, Ellen White's going to talk to us a little bit about the size of the organization. It's not by the largeness of an institution that the greatest work for souls is to be accomplished. A mammoth sanitarium requires many workers. Now, this is key. A mammoth sanitarium requires many workers, and where so many are brought together, it is exceedingly difficult to maintain a high standard of spirituality. Did you get that? The more workers you have, the more danger there is that some of them aren't going to be consecrated, and it's going to drag the rest of them down. So that's one of the strong arguments against a large sanitarium. Large institutions, often it happens that responsible places are filled by workers who are not spiritually minded, who do not exercise wisdom in dealing with those who, if wisely treated, would be awakened, convicted, and converted. Wow. So in other words, you've got to have wisdom. And if you don't have consecrated people at your key levels of management as well as patient contact, you will not be able to do the very work that the sanitarium or the wellness center is designed to do. So, why not large? Because you can't maintain the spirituality. You have to hire a lot of workers, and finding consecrated workers is more difficult than you can imagine. Instead of investing in one medical institution, all the means obtainable, we ought to establish smaller sanitariums in many places. Another reason for smaller sanitariums is it doesn't consume so much resources. And then those resources that are available can be shared with other sanitariums in other places. So, bottom line is you want small sanitariums so that, or small wellness centers, so that you don't consume so much resources. And believe me, a large place costs a lot of money, which I, of course, know from experience. Ellen White was especially in this statement referring to Dr. Kellogg, John Harvey Kellogg, who built a massive sanitarium in Battle Creek. And after it burnt down under the judgments of God, he built it again, even larger, against Ellen White's advice. And needless to say, that building today is no longer a wellness center. It's a federal building. So what have we done today? Well, we followed Kellogg's advice rather than Ellen White's advice. We've done the same thing that Kellogg did. We've built massive medical institutions where SDA medicos and administrators think they're doing the work of the Lord, and there may be a little bit of it going on because God is merciful. You know, He works with everybody in whatever situation He can. But more and more these days, a nurse or a therapist is instructed not to discuss their faith with their clients. Further, they are not following the instruction of the Lord. It's that simple. You know, we have to follow God's instruction if we expect to be successful. Yes, these medical institutions are supposedly successful, and financially they are to some extent, but they're getting increasingly challenged by finances, and they're ending up merging with non-Adventist entities. Some cases even Roman Catholic entities and Baptist entities and other entities. So, you know, it's not a good idea not to follow the Lord and His counsel. Another thing is that we would be much more efficient if we divided our resources among many smaller wellness centers. Maybe what we should do is sell the big hospitals and then take those funds and start wellness centers. Well, I don't think that's going to happen. I just don't see it. But maybe if faithful people will rise up and start the lifestyle centers or the wellness centers, at least there will be places where people can go to receive the proper form of healing without the use of drugs to solve their problems, which don't really solve the problems anyway. The tragedy is that most doctors aren't that interested in medical missionary work. And if they are, they have huge debt that they have to pay down. And so they first have to go and work many years in the public sector and work in doctors' offices or hospitals or whatever, and they're not really able to do the work that God has given us to do because of all the debt they're in. But most of them aren't even interested. They're focused on building their assets and other aspects of their work. But some who are godly use their resources, at least, to help wellness centers get started and other mission projects. So it's not entirely a loss. I'm not wanting to paint the wrong picture here. But the fact is, we need more doctors, both male and female doctors, to become involved and engaged and intensely interested in the success of wellness centers. And they should not be afraid to join themselves to God's work, even if it means a loss of resources, loss of income, or a loss of a certain amount of income. You know, what's more important, the money or souls? What's more important, living nearby a big city where you can minister to people, or in the city itself, or out in the country where you can raise your family on the principles that heaven has ordained? Small wellness centers or home-style wellness centers are much more intimate. Here's another reason for a small place. They're much more intimate. In other words, they're much more conducive to the guests asking questions. You know, often people don't want to talk about their spirituality in a larger setting, you know, when there's a lot of other people around. Because to most people, their spirituality, their heart burdens, their yearning of the soul is, they don't want to talk about this openly, you know. And so they need a place that's more intimate, a place that's more conducive to opening up and letting God change their lives. So it's very important that we have small sanitariums. Here's another statement. It's from Counsels on Health, page 211. Counsels on Health 211. It is that thirsting souls may be led to the living water that we plead for sanitariums. Not expensive mammoth sanitariums, but home-like institutions in pleasant places. So a home-like institution, what does that mean? Well, maybe 2 or 3 guests, maybe 5 guests. If you're really good at it, you can even make a wellness center with 10 guests to be fairly conducive and home-like. But whatever the case, they need to be home-like. The work of God is to be carried on without outward display. Counsels on Health 300. In establishing institutions, we are never to compete with the institutions of the world in size or splendor. We do a different work than the hospitals do. We do a different work than secular organizations. The Battle Creek Sanitarium is too large, 8th volume of the Testimonies, 205. She went on to say, 1/10 of the number of patients who come to that institution is as many as can be cared for with the best results in one medical missionary center. So at that time, there was perhaps 800 or more clients at the Battle Creek Sanitarium. So if 1/10 of that is the amount that can be cared for adequately, that's 80 people. Well, let me tell you, even in today's world, that is really large. I don't know of any existing wellness centers that have that many clients at any given time. They don't have that many bedrooms. Most of them have 10, 12, 15 bedrooms at the max. You know, we're not talking about a lot. The ones that I am most familiar with have 6, 7, you know. Our work in Victoria, Australia has 10 bedrooms, you know, so we would be limited, quite cramped if we had to service 80 clients. But that would be way too much for us to handle. You know, we're dealing with some very intense diseases. We're dealing with some very challenging problems. So we have to think about that. And frankly, I think a smaller sanitarium is actually better, with maybe 5 or 10 at the most guests at any given time. I don't think 10 guests is too many for a city like Melbourne, which is 4 million people. There could be several such places around Melbourne, and many sanitariums will be smaller, you know, than what we have in Australia. Maybe 5, 3, 4 clients, whatever, you know, is suited for the buildings and facilities that they have. Then from 7th volume of the Testimonies, page 59, the Lord has instructed me to warn those who in the future establish sanitariums in new places, to begin their work in humility, consecrating their abilities to His service. The buildings erected are not to be large or expensive. Small local sanitariums are to be established in connection with our training schools. So, in other words, you may have to start with 2 or 3. You know, you take a home with 3 or 4 bedrooms and have 2 or 3 guests. You know, that should do the job. Then as you grow and develop, that can be the way you add, you know, you can add on to that as you go along. That's actually what we're doing in South Australia. We have a 3-bedroom home and a guest house, and so that gives us basically 4 bedrooms to work with. And we're going to actually do a little renovation and end up with 5 bedrooms, or maybe even 6, depending on the circumstances, so that we can then serve 5 or 6 guests. But that's not a lot, you know, not a lot at all. This is from Special Testimonies Series B, page 55. I've been instructed to tell our people that they are not to erect such large buildings for sanitariums. So we have this kind of statement over and over again in many places, warning us to remain small and home-like. Here's a statement on a little different topic. And it is from Ministry of Healing, page 147. Everywhere there is a tendency to substitute the work of organizations for individual effort. Human wisdom tends to consolidation, to centralization, and to the building up of great churches and institutions. Multitudes leave to institutions and organizations the work of benevolence, and and they excuse themselves from contact with the world, and their hearts grow cold. So it's very important to remember that we are to organize our work in a modest way and not centralized. And so even organizations like we have in Victoria, it doesn't have to be centralized under one controlling factor. And the school is run by another organization altogether. Break up the large centers has been the word of the Lord. Carry the light to many places. Those who are desirous of receiving a training for effective medical missionary work should understand that large sanitariums will be conducted so much like institutions of the world that students laboring in such sanitariums cannot obtain a symmetrical training for Christian medical missionary work. So downsize. She's saying to downsize the large interests in some single places and spread them out. Less specialization, more broad thinking leaders need to be involved in God's work. If they're just specialized, you get really focused and you don't see the large work that God needs to have done. Well, we could go on. I would like to point out that we are to also have gardens associated with our sanitariums. She said in Loma Linda Messages, page 475, that in the night season I was given a view of the sanitarium in the country. The institution was not large, but it was complete. It was surrounded by beautiful trees and shrubbery, beyond which were orchards and groves. Connected with the place were gardens in which the lady patients, when they chose, could cultivate the flowers of every description, each patient selecting a special plot for which to care. Well, most of the time our guests aren't around long enough to make this happen. But we're also to teach them that they are to exercise in the garden. It's God's plan, Ellen White said in 8th volume 227, 8th volume of the Testimonies. It is God's plan that agriculture shall be connected with the work of our sanitariums and schools. So the youth, as well as the clients, need the education to be gained from this line of work. And we take our guests and we take them up to the garden and we engage them and show them how to use the garden in their own lives, not only to get their veggies and produce, but also to gain their exercise. And it's a great way to encourage them to tie things together. Well, that's all we have time for today at this session, and I just wanted to say that it's been a great blessing to share these things with you.